Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of the MP Sanders podcast. Today, I'm going to keep it kind of short. I am going to cover how legalization will fix the opioid crisis that we are supposedly going through right now. I recorded a podcast for this, what was it, yesterday or the day before, and it came out to be an hour and 50 minutes long. I covered drug policy, our situation, how it led here. I covered all of it in one episode, and pretty much as soon as I was done recording, I was able to determine that no one who isn't interested in this topic will listen to that, and my goal is to reach people who don't think about this topic much. So that podcast was not going to achieve what I wanted it to. I want people who don't think about our drug policy but are worried about the current state of our society regarding drugs because there are things to be concerned with, and I want to give those people a solution to that problem. With the way things are going now, I think a lot of people assume that the current system we have going is the only system that is viable. And I would argue that the system isn't viable at all. I mean, drugs have been legal since 1970, and drug use rates increase every year. There are still addicts. There are still people dying from drugs. There is still a lot of violence surrounding drug use. I don't really understand what these laws are preventing or what makes people think that they are working to the point that we need to keep them around. And I'm going to line out a couple of the harms that these policies have caused while talking about this issue. As usual, I have a script that I've written out for the podcast, and let's go ahead and get into that. To start, I do not like the phrase opioid crisis at all. I view it as nothing more than the rebranding of the war on drugs. Every single decade since modern prohibition, the Controlled Substances Act, was signed, there has been a new drug epidemic, apparently. In the 70s, it was psychedelics. In the 80s, it was crack. In the 90s, it was MDMA. In the 2000s, it was PCP and meth. In the 2010s, we had bath salts and synthetic cannabinoids. And of course, in the 2020s, we have this issue with opioids. It's a decadal rebranding our society does, and our government. And I think it's to keep people up in arms and invested into the drug war. So let's cover some basic facts. People talk about pharmaceutical companies being the cause of what we are currently experiencing, but the data don't indicate anything like that or that anything particularly destructive took place due to prescription opioids. Only an estimated 3 to 12% of people prescribed these drugs become addicted to them. Less than 6% move on to street drugs, and less than 1% of the people prescribed die to these drugs. And one of the drugs included in these statistics is fentanyl. The number of deaths that prescription opioids cause every year comes to around 20,000 people. Considering that on average, well over 10 million people are prescribed these drugs yearly, it's obvious that death is not a primary concern or likely outcome when prescribed these drugs. I have a hard time understanding what crisis is supposed to be taking place right now, or in the past 5 to 10 years. So, what exactly needs to be happening for a quote unquote drug crisis to be taking place? I've never really received a meaningful and applicable answer to that question. Typically, the answer I get means that we are also in a sugar, tobacco, and alcohol crisis, which is something not many people are willing to claim. There are basic safety concerns that are associated with the use of any drug. None of them are unique necessarily to opioids. There are some irresponsible people out there that take very high doses of their prescriptions, sell their prescriptions, or mix their prescriptions with other drugs. Again, that is not unique to opioids. There are also people who live in terrible environments, are stressed out, live in severe chronic pain to the point where the pain itself disrupts or destroys their lives. There are many reasons that people develop addiction or harmful relationship with drugs. And drugs themselves are never one of those reasons. And that's something that a lot of people don't seem to understand. I will make an entirely separate episode on that issue, but in the meantime, consider this simple fact. Drug use rates do not change much as socioeconomic standing increases. In fact, SAMHSA shows that as you get higher and higher above the poverty level, especially once you are much higher, like 200% of the poverty level, then drug use rates increase, but drug addiction rates drop consistently. Why is that? Because addiction is not caused by drugs, it's caused by poor environments, stress, trauma, and poor mental health. And those things are more likely to be experienced in lower socioeconomic classes. There are other explanations for this data, but that will be covered in the episode directly speaking about addiction. Back to opioids. Toxicologically, they are some of the safest drugs that people can use to treat pain, if the doses are known and regulated. NSAIDs are the leading cause of liver failure in the United States. These drugs are like naproxen, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, etc., the over-the-counter painkillers that people use very regularly. These are far more toxic to your body for specific reasons, mainly due to the acidity of the substances themselves. Opioids do not cause these types of problems to any system in the body at all. The main concern with responsible opioid use, and as I've shown, the majority of people prescribed opioids use them responsibly, is constipation. And chronic constipation is not good for the user's health, but it is also extremely easy to treat with over-the-counter substances. The acidity issue caused by NSAIDs and the liver destruction that they cause is not easily treatable at all. Just because they are the leading cause of liver failure, they don't tend to lead to death, but liver failure itself is extremely damaging. So it isn't something that should be overlooked, and I think it's something that is rarely spoken about. I just had two friends actually, go through some pretty severe surgeries. One of them tore an ACL, and the other one broke his fibula, I believe. Both of them were prescribed 5 milligrams of oxycodone with 325 milligrams of acetaminophen. That is nonsense. Opioids are far more effective at treating pain than NSAIDs. Some studies have shown that NSAIDs aren't even effective at killing moderate to severe pain to begin with. And I think that the reason we are including these insane doses of highly acidic and toxic drugs in our opioids is as an abuse deterrent. Our government would rather us have liver failure than take enough of an opioid to feel good while we are in pain. Now, that's mostly conjecture, but given our country's track record and how they treat drug users, I don't think it's irresponsible conjecture at all. Now, this conversation changes pretty significantly when talking about recreational opioid use. However, there are some things that should be made clear about this as well. The attention has shifted in recent years from the focus on prescription opioids to people using them on the street, mainly because of how many overdose deaths they are involved in every year. It's important to remember that only 10 to 20% of recreational drug users, regardless of drug class, are addicts. The rest are responsible people that take care of their families, pay their taxes, do their jobs, and are generally normal and productive members of society. That includes opioids. Now, some drugs have a higher percentage of people addicted to them or a higher number of total addicts than others. But what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that some drugs are more addictive than others? No. There is no evidence for that, and there has never been evidence for that. And to be clear, when I'm talking about addiction, I am referring to substance use disorder as defined by the DSM-5. There is a simple determining factor about which drugs will end up having more people addicted to them, and that determining factor is availability. The most used drug by addicts in the country, and the drug that has the most people addicted to it, is alcohol. Alcohol is also the most used drug by homeless people, which is something I rarely hear acknowledged by the people who claim drugs like heroin and fentanyl are causing homelessness and poverty. The vast majority of the people that are homeless, supposedly due to these two drugs, or meth is often thrown in there as well, are using as much or more alcohol than they are those other drugs. Yet I rarely, if ever, hear these same people saying that alcohol is causing homelessness. The reason for that is simple. Many of the people saying these things are alcohol users. After all, how could alcohol cause addiction and homelessness and poverty if I'm drinking it and do just fine throughout my life? I think that's the general mentality applied to this topic. This mentality also comes from the reluctance to acknowledge, or the general ignorance to, the fact I mentioned earlier that the vast majority of all drug users are not addicts. The people who use opioids recreationally and are normal, responsible people tend not to be out in the open about their use for obvious reasons. The only people, or at least the main group of people who are generally willing to be open about their opioid use, are the homeless addicts. So they are the only people these drugs become associated with. So these claims that heroin and fentanyl cause addiction and homelessness and things like this, those claims are powered by selection and confirmation bias, not actual data. This availability issue is also true with heroin, which is why I'm very specific when saying that statistic applies to classes of drugs or drug users as a whole. And I don't think it's intellectually dishonest to make this claim. This availability issue is also true of drugs like heroin. It is true that around 23 to 25% of people who use heroin are addicts, and that is slightly above the 20% standard. And the reason for that is that it's cheaper, more available, and more potent. And what potency ultimately determines is the amount of the drug you will need to take to achieve desirable effects. So you will have to take less heroin to achieve those effects than you would with oxycodone. So a supply of 50 milligrams of heroin is going to last you longer simply due to that fact. You won't have to take as much at a time. If you have 50 milligrams of heroin and 50 milligrams of oxycodone and you're trying to achieve the same effects, you will go through the oxycodone quicker. So no one is going to go out of their way to spend more money on a supply that won't last them as long. This statistic regarding heroin is a result of the drug market, not addictive potential, and it has very little to do with pharmacology, unless you are willing to count the potency aspect that I brought up. But that's more pharmacokinetic than it is pharmacologic. Addictive potential is a nonsense phrase to begin with, but like I said, that will be saved for another podcast episode. Dr. Carl Hart did a great and brave thing when he quote unquote came out about his heroin use. He is a high level professor, one of the world's leading experts on addiction and the behavioral side of drug use. He has published dozens of highly cited and highly regarded scientific papers and articles on this topic and has received hundreds of millions of dollars in grants from the government to conduct these studies. Him coming out allowed people to recognize that heroin use does not equal addiction and death. He has even said that many people he works with or has worked with in the past use drugs of various kinds, including heroin and other opioids, but they are unable to talk about it publicly because it poses a risk to their career. And it certainly does pose a risk to their career. So before I move on to the final point of this podcast, I will say this one last time. The vast majority of opioid users, even recreational opioid users, are not addicts. They are normal and responsible people that enjoy taking opioids in their spare time, like many do with alcohol. Let's stop associating opioid use with homeless addicts because it doesn't paint an accurate picture and is part of the reason we are in the situation that we are currently in. The last issue I would like to cover is arguably the most important one regarding opioids in society today. That is opioid overdose deaths. First, let's make it clear that alcohol kills more people than all opioids combined, and that isn't just because alcohol is used by more people. More people use alcohol than tobacco, but tobacco kills more people. More people use caffeine than alcohol, but alcohol kills more people. The amount of deaths associated with a drug will be directly related to their toxicity profile, type of intoxication they cause, and the policy surrounding the drug. Since I've already covered the toxicity concern, at least a little bit, and established that opioids are not very toxic to the body, especially when compared to drugs like alcohol and NSAIDs, I want to focus on the policy surrounding the drug. And I also want to make clear that bringing up alcohol is not whataboutism. I'm not saying that just because alcohol is dangerous, that means we should legalize heroin and fentanyl. That's not what I'm saying at all. The point I'm trying to make while bringing that up is that anything you can say about heroin and fentanyl and more could be said about alcohol, but we do not allow that fact to prohibit alcohol. We tried that once before and we all acknowledged that it failed, and how we were able to convince ourselves that policies that failed with covering one drug will somehow be extremely effective and work when covering hundreds of drugs is still a mystery to me. The other point I'm trying to make with that is to establish that our drug policy was not written due to scientific data or pharmacological reasons. These policies were written via emotion. They were misinterpreting terrible things that take place like drug overdose deaths and addiction and violence and all of these things and scapegoating drugs. And so the reasonable conclusion to come to when you are blaming drugs for these things is to try to limit access to them. But it is important to acknowledge that it has not limited access and that the policies have not achieved anything that they claim to set out to achieve. Now, back to the overdose issue. I claim that our drug policy is the leading cause of overdose deaths in the country and not the inanimate molecules. The first obvious line of evidence for this claim is that more people are prescribed opioids every year than use illicit opioids recreationally, and far more people die from the recreational illicit use. And no, this isn't just because of addiction, and no, it isn't because the drugs are any different. First, the addiction rate of recreational use isn't much different between the two categories. Prescription addiction rates average at around 11%, and the recreational addiction rates average around 13 to 15. The other way we know that it is not a reliable explanation is by looking at the death rates among teenagers. Teenagers are a great unit of measurement for first-time or at least novice drug users. Most of them do not have years of experience with these drugs, and the addiction rate is much lower because they haven't had the time or opportunity to become addicted to these drugs. To be clear, that isn't to say there are zero teenagers with substance use disorder, it's just to say that the majority of teenage drug users are first-time/novice drug users. Even though their drug use rates have been dropping rather steadily throughout the years, their drug overdose rates have been increasing steadily. This is largely due to the fact that there is no regulatory oversight of the current illicit drug market. I can prove that claim as well. First, take a look at this image. This is from a lab that does GCMS analysis on illegally purchased drugs off the street and posts the results online. People can mail their samples in, wait a couple of weeks, and know exactly what is in their product due to the tremendous work of this lab. All of these products on the screen were either sold as heroin or contain heroin. Notice that there is not a single product on this page or on this website, as far as I can tell, that contains only heroin. Many of them don't contain heroin at all. Even if they do contain heroin, heroin is usually not the substance that has the highest concentration in the product. The other problem this lack of regulatory oversight causes is that the purity is unknown as well. When that is the case, it is impossible to determine accurate dosage, which can obviously lead to dangerous situations. When people don't know what they're taking or how much of what they're taking, it is impossible to take the product safely. We can change that very easily with some simple policy changes. We, as a society, should advocate for making drug use as safe as possible. Our current policies make drug use as dangerous as possible. If you want more evidence that our policy is the leading cause of opioid overdose deaths, aside from the fact that no one knows what they're taking, and it is abundantly clear by this picture that I'm bringing up again, that the supply is extremely toxic. Fentanyl has a much lower average lethal dose than heroin. So if you take fentanyl thinking it is heroin, the chances of you overdosing and dying are extremely high. If anyone took any of these products on this screen thinking it was heroin, there is a high percent chance that they are now dead. And there's evidence and studies that have shown that the average amount of drugs in the system of someone who has died of a drug overdose is 6. The reason for that is abundantly clear when looking at these images. People don't know what they're taking, and they don't know how much of what they're taking. And it is not just addicts experiencing this issue, as I showed with the teenage death rate. There is another possible explanation for 6 drugs being in the system of people who die of drug overdoses. I don't think it's quite as potent of a cause, but it is still common, and I am positive that it still happens. And that cause is that we don't have drug education in this country, so people don't know what drugs they can and cannot safely combine. And I will make an episode about what good drug education looks like, and I will make an episode giving good drug education in the near future. So anyone who watches that episode will be able to consume most drugs that are commonly used recreationally safely. That is the end goal with my advocacy and my willingness to teach and talk and lecture about this topic. I want less people to die of drug overdoses, and I think an effective way of doing that is to tell people how to use drugs safely. I do not think an effective way of doing that is telling people not to use drugs at all, which is the current state of our drug policy. Imagine if you went to a driver's education course and the only thing they talked about was car crashes, and they did not tell you how to regulate your speed, how to steer the car, how to use your blinkers, how to use the windshield wipers when it's raining, how to buckle your seatbelt, etc. And the only thing they showed you the entire time was statistics of car crashes and pictures of car crashes. No one would be able to drive safely given that that is the only education that they have. And that is currently what we are doing with drugs in this country, and I think it is way past time that we change our approach to that. Our society claims that we ban dangerous drugs. That isn't true either. Lead isn't a controlled substance. Mercury is not a controlled substance. Thousands of different extremely potent neurotoxins, including alcohol, save the extremely potent part, are not controlled substances. We do not ban dangerous substances, we ban enjoyable ones. Drugs are not illegal because they're dangerous because they're illegal. We should focus on passing policies that limit the dangers of drug use, not policies that exacerbate them. We, as a society, should also advocate for our people's liberty to pursue happiness however they see fit, as long as they are not preventing others from doing the same, even if they pursue happiness via drug use. We should want to live up to the claim that we are a free society, and we are failing to do so right now. It's important to acknowledge that freedom is dangerous. Allowing adults to make decisions for themselves and chase happiness for themselves is a dangerous thing to do. Not only in terms of physical danger, but psychological and economic danger as well. People may chase things that don't make any money and end up homeless. They may pursue freedom in ways that pose a risk to themselves, like jumping motorcycles or doing stunts for movies or shooting guns competitively or any other thing that possesses a level of risk, driving cars fast, riding motorcycles. There are so many things that we are allowed to do as free people that carry inherent risk, and some of those things carry inherent risk of death. But the inherent risk of death or physical harm is never grounds to ban something until it is applied to drugs. And I understand why that is, and that will also be covered in a different episode. There are two things that I want you to leave this podcast thinking about. The first is that every single negative thing that you and our society attribute to drug use is made worse by prohibition. Take violence, for example. The only reason there is violence surrounding drug distribution in this country is because we have put the power of drug distribution into the hands of illegal criminal organizations called cartels. This took place in our country during alcohol prohibition as well. Bootlegging gangs are extremely famous as sort of anti-heroes in American culture. Take Al Capone, for example. That is an issue that no longer takes place with alcohol distribution. And it's important to acknowledge that CVS and Walgreens distribute many of these same drugs across the entire country, and they do so with zero violence being left in their wake. The second and last thing that I want you to leave this episode thinking about is that we can end the quote-unquote opioid crisis with simple policy decisions and by allowing all adults the freedom to legally access a regulated drug market. We can make the decision to lower the amount of opioid overdose deaths in this country if we allow data and evidence to drive our policy rather than fear and emotion. I know that it is a triggering emotional reaction when someone says that we need to allow adults to have legal access to heroin and fentanyl. But the presence of that emotional reaction does not dispel or disqualify any of the data and evidence that point to the fact that doing so would make using those drugs safer and would lead to less people dying. So please, like, subscribe, leave a comment. We can talk about this in the comments in as much detail for as long as you'd like. That is encouraged. I greatly appreciate anyone listening. And there are a lot of podcasts incoming with what I consider to be a lot of very good and thought-provoking information. So again, thank you. Feel free to follow me on social media. I have a TikTok at mp.author and Twitter at the drugbookmp. Thank you guys, and there is more coming soon.